So a warm welcome to all of you to tonight's talk on the far right's glorification of Putin, German and American perspectives. Let's just wait for another second. Well, so again, welcome to all of you. My name is Christiane Püker. I'm the director of the German American Center Stuttgart. Together with the Association of the German American Centers in Germany, we are offering a series on the current events in Ukraine. War has returned to Europe and the world is under shock. Over 2 million refugees have fled Ukraine so far, and the number of lost lives rises daily. While most politicians agree and condemn Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin is met with much approval and admiration in the milieu of conspiracists and right-wing extremists on both sides of the Atlantic. The Russian autocrat is celebrating as a white savior and as a hero. The downright enthusiasm in the far-right political camp in the US and also in Germany for the Russian president seems to need more than an explanation. That is why today we are looking into the roots of German and American far-right's affinity with Putin. We will also talk about political implications that might follow, for example, during this year's midterm elections in the US. We invited two experienced observers of political and political developments here in Germany and the United States, German journalist Arthur Landwehr and US political expert Dr. Wiliam Gaston. Many of our German viewers will know Arthur Landwehr. He is one of the voices and also one of the faces of German public radio and television. He is currently working for the second time as a foreign correspondent for ARD in Washington, D.C. He has also been an honorary professor at Rhein-Main University of Applied Sciences in Wiesbaden since 2018. Arthur Landwehr will introduce his discussion partner, Dr. Wiliam Gaston, in a little bit. Thank you both very much for being with us today. We have planned the talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, approximately, after which we look forward to our audience questions. You can use the Q&A button to type in questions, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible afterwards. If you feel more comfortable asking the question in German, you can do so, and we will translate them. And now, Dr. Gaston, Herr Landwehr, thank you for being here again. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for Püker for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me as the moderator this evening. It's really a great honor to be the one who can ask the questions for our distinguished guest tonight, Wiliam Gaston. When a few days ago, I read in his last book about anti-pluralism, the populist threat to liberal democracy, I said, wow. Almost 4 years ago, Wiliam Gaston described exactly what we are talking about tonight, the affinity extremist political groups to the right and to the left are having for Vladimir Putin's way to rule Russia in Europe and the United States. Today, you can read Wiliam Gaston's political insights every week in his column for the Wall Street Journal. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., one of the most distinguished think tanks here in town. He holds the Ezra Zilker Chair in their governance studies program. And he knows politics inside out, and also the hands-on part, also the hard part. He participated in 6 presidential campaigns, and whoever campaign in his or her life knows what that means. Then from 1993 to 1995, he served as Deputy Assistant for Domestic Policy for President Clinton. And last but not least, he previously served as professor and acting dean at the University of Maryland's School of Public Affairs. Wiliam Gaston, welcome to our discussion, and I'm really happy to have you here and be able to talk to you.
It's wonderful to be here, and I'm looking forward to our dialogue very much. And by the way, I hope very much that you will not only pose questions, but also add your insights from a German and a European point of view, because I am by no means, a universal savant of all of these things.
So I try and see whatever I can provide. And but let me ask with one question and an observation. I would like to start with Fox News host Tucker Carlson, that all of us who work here in Washington know very well. He has the most successful show on Fox News, one of the very conservative shows, and someone called Carlson one of the biggest cheerleaders for Russia recently. And his remarks about Vladimir Putin one day before the invasion made a lot of headlines here. He asked viewers a series of questions about, first of all, he asked the viewers why they are so critical about Putin. And he asked questions like, had Putin ever promoted racial discrimination in schools? Did he make fentanyl or other drugs? Did he attempt to snuff out Christianity, or had he eaten dogs? And he was answering all these questions with a no, of course. And he was saying, you see, he doesn't bother us and he doesn't have our problems. And he interpreted this critical notion most Americans have towards Putin as another parroting of Biden's policy by mainstream media. So he said that hating Putin had become the central purpose of American foreign policy. Carlson, I mean, he's a showmaster and he has to please an audience. So who was he preaching to?
Who was he preaching to? Well, if you decode what Mr. Carlson said in that famous litany of rhetorical questions, you will find the following themes, I believe. First of all, note the reference to eating dogs. That's something that the Chinese do, but not the Russians. So that question is shorthand for our real enemy is China and not Russia. I could go through each and every one of those rhetorical questions, and indicate what the real target is. In the context of US domestic policy, many of those questions refer to the so-called culture wars in America. And it's important to understand that in American politics on the right, but not only on the right, the old arguments about the role of government in the economy have been supplanted and even replaced by new cultural arguments and the appropriate role of government in addressing the questions that the culture warriors are hurling at each other. And so, as I said in my article that talked about Mr. Carlson, among others, the overriding message of his questions and his comments that night was that the culture war matters more than anything that happens past our borders. It matters more than whether government taxes too much or too little, whether it gets bigger or smaller. Those are antique debates, he was suggesting, left over from the Reagan administration. That was then, this is now. And he was implying that cultural conservatives are now waging a rearguard defensive battle for the soul of the United States and for control of its key institutions, not only public, but also private and non-governmental as well. And so he was saying, if you don't like woke law schools, if you don't like woke chief executives of major corporations, if you don't like government that does everything it can to urge them on to new depths of cultural extremism, then forget about Vladimir Putin, forget about the war in Ukraine, although this, as you point out, was just a day before that. Forget about all of those overseas misadventures and focus on our country, America first, not only as a political slogan, but also as a cultural slogan. That's my interpretation.
Oh, that's interesting, because if you look at the same time in Germany, you had, for example, the AfD backpedaling a lot after the invasion, because for the invasion, a lot of people were defending Putin and were defending his policy and saying there's no way he will ever invade Ukraine. He's just showing his power. But on the other hand, reacting to all the mistakes the Americans and the Europeans and the Germans made many years before, and it is his right to defend his own country. So, and there was a lot of excuse for him. And then we had all this backpedaling, and we had the same thing on the left side. If you look at many members of Die Linke in Germany, we had the same notion, we had the same arguments. How is this here? How is this in the United States? Did you observe and recognize the same way of backpedaling after the war started?
There are some differences between the United States and Germany, and I'll get to them, but we do have one thing in common, and that is that a lot of people who are making sympathetic noises about Mr. Putin, have been backpedaling very significantly. I will confess, bring myself to watch Tucker Carlson's show on a regular basis, but I have seen reports to the effect that even he has realized that he had an indefensible position, was dangerously exposed to a backlash. And so he too has tried to adjust without disavowing his previous views in any way. Many politicians on the right who were favorable to Putin largely because Donald Trump was favorable to Putin, and who were unfavorable to Ukraine because Donald Trump notoriously hated Ukraine because they wouldn't bend to his will. Many of those politicians have changed their tune. And I am inclined to accept the repentance of sinners as long as it's sincere and lasting. So welcome aboard, previous Putin lovers, if you've been sobered up by mass slaughter just a little bit. Now, let me get to an important distinction between the United States and Germany. Because of your history after after the end of the Second World War, because of the fact that there was an independent East Germany for more than 40 years, because East Germany was under communist control, there are some vestiges of, shall we say, communist thinking in parts of Germany. And certainly Die Linke is the center, the rallying point of those attitudes. So to put it simply, you had, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, a small but not insignificant core of support for communism and for Russia. In the United States, we have no such thing. We have a communist party that barely exists. Their executive committee could meet in a telephone booth. There'd be room left over. And our most significant leftists are democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders. And Sanders, of course, has issued a series of ringing defenses of Ukraine and all-out denunciations of Vladimir Putin. He never flirted for a minute with neutrality between Ukraine and Russia. He can recognize an aggression when he sees one. He can recognize a despot when he sees one. So our political spectrum on the left doesn't extend nearly as far left as Germany's does, which is not to say that Die Linke is a candidate for membership in any coalition in Germany that I can think of. And so it is a marginal party, but it does exist, and we have no such party in the United States.
But the interesting thing is we are looking at conservative people here in the United States. You just mentioned Donald Trump and all those people who follow him, who still acknowledge him as their leader, as
Yes.
the one who defines what their political thinking is. These are very conservative people. And Russia, and even if we go further back to the time of the Soviet Union, that has always been the enemy for everybody in this country. And it has always been the ideological counterpart and the incarnation of evil, if you want. So what attracts these conservative people who are, we will probably talk a little bit more about the culture war that was going on that you just mentioned, but all these followers of Donald Trump, not all of them, but some of these followers of Donald Trump, what is it that attracts them to a person like Putin?
Good question. Well, first of all, if you look at American history after the Second World War, conservatives were willing to become internationalists, which, as you know, previously they had not wanted to be. The Republican Party was the hotbed of isolationism between the First and the Second World Wars. And some of that remained after the Second World War, but there was a great debate inside the Republican Party, which culminated with the internationalists within the Republican Party on the ascendancy. The core of that was not opposition to Russia. It was anti-communism. Mm-hmm. And being against communism didn't necessarily mean that you were in favor of democracy. It meant that you were against communism. And the most frequent adjective that conservatives applied to the Soviet Union during that period was godless, without God. The argument was that communists were atheists, and that atheism was the core of what was wrong with communism, and religion was the core of what was right about the West. They have not abandoned that view. And it is important to understand that Mr. Putin, at least in the United States, has presented himself as the avatar of socially conservative Christian nationalism. Many of Mr. Trump's followers are socially conservative Christian nationalists. And so there is a natural attraction, which Mr. Trump, of course, went out of his way to nurture during his 4 years as president. Having said all of this, I think one of the things that I do as a political analyst is to watch survey research very carefully. And a poll that came out just a few days ago indicate that in the American population, approval of and support for Mr. Putin now stands at 6%. 6%, right? So, so there's about, so that's just a little bit smaller than the percentage of the vote that Die Linke gets in Germany. And so we should not think of this as a mass phenomenon. It may have been at one point, but the events of the past 3 weeks have been a real turning point in American public opinion, not only on the conservative side, but certainly centrally on the conservative side.
Yeah, but if you look back a few weeks ago, I can't really recall where the polls were standing when it came to supporting Putin, but they were significantly higher than 6%. And it's and one of my questions was, and you almost answer, or in part answer that, is it an affinity towards this person, Putin, or Russia, or Putin's Russia?
I'd say that in the same way that the affinity of many Americans for what I'll call Trumpism is fundamentally an affinity for Trump. The affinity, it's really not an embrace of Putin's Russia. It's an embrace of Putin. And I've already indicated the grounds on which many of Mr. Trump's supporters feel a kinship with him. There's one other element of this approval, and that is the idea of strength. Right? And on certain portions of the right, there is, I would say, an excessively high regard for strength, not only strength of personal character, not only for firm purpose that nothing will deter you from, but also with the political use of strength, including force. There are people who are really impatient with how slowly and inefficiently a constitutional democracy operates. This is a phenomenon.
They should come to Europe and see how long it can take to start something compared to the United States.
I understand, but Americans are comparing themselves to their past, and they're also taking their guidance from their desires, which can be.
There's this person who's not talking, someone who's doing, who's just making decisions.
Right, and that is, that is equated with a certain form of masculine strength. Endless talking is equated with the feminine. Getting on with it and just doing it, disregarding the obstacles, and it has to be said, disregarding institutional and moral restraints in the name of achieving your objectives is a very attractive attribute, not just in America, but wherever people are impatient with government that seems not to be delivering what they want, they are ready to consider strength over everything else.
In your first remarks, you mentioned the word woke. So that is one of the words that's being discussed here in the United States so much, and that is something that, in a way, makes some people insecure. And it is one of the major words, or the core words, for this culture war that's going on here. What does this country stand for? Who defines what America means? What it means to be an American? Is America this country everybody was thinking about when you think about the 1950s, leading country of the world, with all the moral rules the United States had at that time? Or is it this fight we are seeing now between the different groups, starting with Black Lives Matter? We have the gay rights discussion, we have the discussion about abortion and all these things, and it seems like a lot of people, especially in rural areas, have become insecure about their own identity and what to think, and not finding themselves being represented in mainstream media anymore. So, and now you have, on the other hand, someone like Putin who just goes, who just does not accept anything like this. So woke is something that would never happen in Putin's Russia. Does that play a role in how you, as you observe it?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, Arthur. And it is not clear to me that the sorts of people that you just named are insecure about their identity. I think they know exactly who they are, but they feel that they're under threat, not identity threat, but political threat. They are afraid that their freedom to live their lives as they choose is under threat, could be taken away from them. Part of this has to do with ancient quarrels between nationalism and localism within the United States. But part of it has to do with the fact that the national government, in their eyes, has taken sides in a cultural debate, and from their standpoint has taken the wrong side. But some of them say, just don't take sides at all. Let me give you an example. Before Roe v. Wade, there was a variety of legal regimes in the 50 states. And some of them were becoming increasingly permissive, others not so. Roe v. Wade abolished that diversity and established a single national standard, which was accorded constitutional roots and significance. And some people are saying the national government simply should not take sides in a cultural and moral debate where there are conflicting views and where states and regions disagree with each other. Let us settle it, and we will not feel so threatened by the imposition of a single national standard that we cannot in good conscience accept. That is not an illogical argument, whatever you think of it. Many critics of that argument say, well, if we hadn't established a single national standard in matters of race, we'd still have segregation and Jim Crow and a substantial portion of our population that didn't have the right to vote. That is absolutely true. And that then raises the question, which the conservatives, particularly in rural areas, are raising, namely, does everything have to be handled in the same way that race was handled? Can't we distinguish between genuine injustices that must be abolished, as slavery was in a stroke? Can't we distinguish between that and other cultural disputes where there may not be such an obvious right answer?
And do that on the state level or even local level?
State level or even a local level. And, now, one of the things that's interesting, and we could have a good time discussing this if we had the time, many conservative governors who are opposed to the national government are also opposed to diffusing some of their responsibility to local areas who might make decisions that they, the governors, don't like. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy at work here, I believe. But at any rate, I just note that when you have such a complex political system with a national government, state governments, and then local governments and authorities that enjoy a substantial amount of autonomy, that is bound to happen.
One other topic I would like to talk about is the aftermath of this war and in which way it could change America and the way Americans think about the world, about Russia, and not only Putin, but also about themselves. We were talking about Donald Trump, our president for 4 years, and his relation to Russia, to Putin, and to Ukraine. He was impeached because of his the way how he handled the relations to Ukraine, and he was supported by a lot of people, as we were saying. So seeing this war now, seeing the brutality of this war, could that change something about how Americans, conservative Americans, think about about the 4 years of Trump presidency, about the person Donald Trump?
It could. And I say that because as I've analyzed public opinion surveys and written about them and their potential significance, I have seen a degree of unity, across the usual lines of division, not only about the analysis of who started this war, not only the analysis of who's the aggressor and who's the victim. There's perfect clarity on these questions and near unanimity in the United States between Democrats and Republicans, but also there's an enormous amount of agreement across members of parties in an otherwise polarized system about how we should respond to it, right? And most people accept the line that President Biden has drawn. There's obviously a little bit of a gray area. There's disagreement, for example, about the delivery of MiG jets to Ukraine. But by and large, Americans say that we should be doing everything to help Ukraine short of risking a direct confrontation with Russia. And that is not a disagreement across party lines. At one time, it might have been. So the question is, will this endure? Will this be a permanent turning point? Will this be a possible source of unity in parties that have been increasingly polarized, drifting farther and farther apart from each other in recent years? So President Biden could respond in a way that would rebuild the sort of national unity of purpose that we saw coming into focus in the late 1940s with Harry Truman's announcement of the Truman Doctrine to oppose communism, and then of course the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, and the creation of a global anti-communist alliance, which did unite the two political parties. But in order to do that, President Biden, I believe, and this is not an analysis that everybody in my political party accepts, but I'll lay it out for you. President Biden will have to acknowledge that we have now entered a new geopolitical situation that calls upon the United States to undertake new burdens that it previously thought that it might be able to avoid. And I would put it this way. During the Second World War, we had enemies on two fronts. Enemies, a major power on the east, a major power in the west, who united to try to oppose the United States and the Allies and defeat them by all means possible. After the Second World War, we were reduced to only one enemy, right? After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we spent some time, more than a decade, believing that we had no enemies. And now, for the first time in more than 3/4 of a century, we have two enemies again. What are we going to do, right? The logic of the situation, if we want to be the head of an alliance that opposes Russia in Europe and China in Asia, we are going to have to reverse the steady decline in our defense budget as a percentage of our gross national product. We are going to have to spend a lot more time focused on the kind of geopolitics that characterized the Cold War period. And the Democratic Party, which has focused principally on domestic issues for decades, will have to become, one might say, binocular. We will have to be able to see the world as well as our own situation and pay as much attention to the world, not just because it affects us directly, but because there is a system of purposes and values that links us to certain forms of government and certain countries around the world. And if we don't accept our role as the renewed leader of these two alliances, then many of the people who are now hoping to be able to govern themselves won't be able to. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we accept giving them that opportunity as a central purpose of our national existence? I could go on in this vein for quite some time, but President Biden has the opportunity to seize the moment and reorient the country. Whether he wants to do so, I do not know. Whether his party will follow him, I do not know. But there is that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And there's, if I understand you right, there is this opportunity for this country to overcome the division the country has experienced for so many years now, especially during the last 4 years, and reunite again through this threat from outside.
Overcome is a slightly stronger verb.
Okay.
Than I would use. I would say counterbalance.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, for many years now, we have been fighting about everything. And perhaps we've entered a period where there are some things that we continue to fight about, but other things, some big things that we agree on.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the other hand, isn't it ironic that the last presidents, like Trump, the same as Obama and George W. Bush, they all wanted to concentrate on Asia. So we need to find our policy towards Asia, towards China, and they all were forced to look into the other direction and look to the West or the South again. So either had to fight terrorism in the Middle East, had to concentrate on the Middle East. Now it's Russia again. Now it's Europe again, and no time, no power, and no resources to concentrate on Asia again. So when will that happen?
Well, we have the resources. The question is, do we have the will?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there was a period in the United States when we were spending more than 10% of our gross national product on defense. Right now it's between 3 and 4%. I'm not recommending that we go back to the quasi-wartime footing of 10%, but we are going to have to spend and devote a larger share of our gross domestic product to defense and related considerations if we want to take on, a battle for democracy on two fronts. That is inevitable, and that's part of the great discussion that we have to have in this country. Are we willing to do that?
Mm-hmm. Now, before we come to question and answers, there's just one thing that came when I was preparing, and there was one article I was reading about, and it was about Pat Robertson. He's 91 years old now, one of the leaders of the evangelical right and the political religion in the United States. And we will come back to this, to Putin's attack on the Ukraine. And he was saying Putin was compelled by God to invade Ukraine, procuring the end time battle in Israel. Ukraine is the staging ground for the ultimate move to fight Israel. Is the religious right still strong enough? I mean, we probably don't have to take this very seriously. But on the other hand, is the religious right still strong enough to have influence on this and other issues in the United States?
The religious right has a lot of influence in the United States, but I don't think a lot of them are going to be rallying around that particular statement.
Okay.
As you mentioned, Mr. Robertson is now 91 years old. I think he is no longer a central focus of the religious right. And he always stood for a brand of theology that, let us say, stretched credulity. For example, his claim that a few years ago that the spate of hurricanes, battering the East Coast was God's punishment for a country that recognized the legitimacy of same-sex marriage. Well, if you can believe that, you believe everything, I guess.
Okay, so we leave it there and see what questions we have come up already. So, and I start one from Michael Davis, and he is saying, do you think that the 24-hour Fox News and other conservative media outlets narrative that Biden is senile, weak, ineffective with Ukraine politics, and that the war would never have happened under Trump because Putin was afraid of him, has little influence on a large segment of the US population? This narrative is unrelenting, he's saying. Are you still optimistic that the US might become more united?
I am still optimistic that in certain circumstances, including what I would regard as correct decisions by the President of the United States, it could become more united. I was careful to say in my answer to you that we would not become fully united, that we would continue to argue about many things. And I suppose there are people who believe the Fox News narrative that this question just summarized. As yet, I haven't seen much support for it in the survey research, but of course, that could change. And there is a perception that Mr. Biden has not been a strong leader. And I suppose if you try hard enough, you can expand that to the conclusion that, well, because Donald Trump was a strong leader, that Mr. Putin was afraid of him and therefore wouldn't have done this. I cannot find any evidence whatsoever that Mr. Putin was scared of Mr. Trump. Au contraire, I think he'd found the first American president in his lifetime, who did not oppose either his way of thinking or his fundamental purposes, which is sort of an odd sort of person to be scared of. So I cannot deny the possibility that if this is the message for the next 3 years, and if Mr. Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, that it could have some power. But if Mr. Trump is once again the nominee of the Republican Party for a third time in a row, an almost unprecedented event, by the way, then many other things will be in dispute and up for grabs, not just the origins of the war in Ukraine.
This is not a question that's coming here, but that just came to me after I've read this question. Do you think that the conservative media outlets like Fox News and others will change through this war because of this war?
I believe that Fox News is a business. And like many businesses, they would like to expand and retain their customer base. What we've seen repeatedly in recent years and even recent months is that Fox News adjusts what I'll call the party line if it comes to believe that a certain approach to an issue is costing them viewers. And so my prediction is that Fox News will evolve in response to its assessment of its potential pool of customers. And so I think that just pushes the question back a step. There were many lifelong Republicans who had been internationalists for decades, who had been isolationists for decades, who became internationalists after the Second World War. And I don't think we can rule out the possibility that something of that sort will happen again in response to these events.
So they're, like so many others, it's a business, and as a business, you have to be opportunistic to
yes, absolutely.
What the people want. Okay,
now, I don't expect Fox to become a great champion of Black Lives Matter.
No.
I do think that these adjustments will occur within a certain range of political opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Sure, but they still have their audience base, and they need to serve them. The next question is, why is Putin considered a white savior? What does it have with a white, since Ukrainians are white also?
That's a very good question, and I don't think that the people who regard him as a white savior are going to be deeply troubled by that question, although they should be. And because I think for them, the idea that Mr. Putin is, a white conservative Christian nationalist is all they need to know about it. Mm-hmm. And if he has to attack some white people, I think they're prepared to go along with that. Mm-hmm. But I can't prove that. That's just my hunch.
Okay, but the next question fits to that. It's from Julia Merkel. The Christian right was a strong force in the Trump administration, and I'm astonished that you would downplay their role. What will happen to the opposition of Russia, with Putin seen as a spearhead of white Christianity, if Trump gets reelected?
That's a fair question, and I am not downplaying their influence. What I am saying is that their influence has focused on a number of domestic cultural issues. At least as I read them, they haven't been big players in the foreign policy debate in the United States. And if Mr. Trump tells them that circumstances have changed and that the United States has to stand up to Mr. Putin, when he violates certain norms and crosses certain boundaries and barriers, I think they will accept that from him. And why do I believe that? Because opinion about Russia within the Republican Party changed fundamentally between 2015 and 2020. The Christian conservatives were part of the coalition at the beginning and at the end in just about equal measure, but they gave priority to a certain view of Vladimir Putin because Trump convinced them to. If he changes his mind about some of that, which he could, I believe they'll follow him. I don't think they're, I think their Christian national conservatism would be compatible with a change in US policy towards and attitudes about Vladimir Putin. So I'm glad I had a chance to clear up that misunderstanding. I have no desire to minimize their influence, but to some extent, Donald Trump has influenced them, not just the other way around.
He used them in a way.
Well, except that, let's be careful now, because from the standpoint of Christian conservatives, he is the first Republican president who gave them more than lip service. He gave them what they wanted and thought they would never get: a conservative Supreme Court that has the power to overturn a series of decisions in the cultural sphere to which they're fundamentally opposed. Ronald Reagan didn't do that. George Bush the elder didn't do that. George Bush the younger didn't do that. Only Donald Trump did.
Mm-hmm. And they served him by bringing their constituency to the polls and vote for him.
They did indeed. And, they have some of the organizational capacity that labor unions in the United States used to have, and they've used it.
Mm-hmm. Next question is, what role does fake news or disinformation campaigns play, and has this gotten better now that a lot of Russian accounts have been suspended by major social media platforms?
I think that's been a big help. But I would add the very aggressive use of tactics to counter disinformation by the Biden administration turned out to be enormously effective. And this is something I haven't seen in my adult lifetime. That is the strategic and tactical use of private intelligence findings in order to discredit Russian disinformation before Russians even begin to propagate it. And so I think this has been a clean win for the United States and its allies in the information war. And I don't think that Mr. Putin has convinced anybody that Ukrainians are mounting a war of genocide against Russians, that they are preparing chemical weapon attacks on Russia, et cetera, et cetera. I think Putin's public information or disinformation campaign has fallen flat because we figured out how to get in front of it. So I think I guess the lesson I would draw from this is it's not just social media.
Yeah, because the
government has a big role.
The government had a big role, and they used the traditional media for it. That was the interesting thing. They used press conferences and came up with a new way of transparency. Transparency we had never seen. Just publishing anything the CIA and other agencies had found out, and this was really interesting to see how that worked, and how it convinced people in this country.
Well, I think that it's going to, I know it's often said that journalism is the first draft of history. I think in order to understand this particular phenomenon clearly, we're going to need second drafts and third drafts as well, because I am positive, I'm convinced that all of this had to be very carefully coordinated with the intelligence community. And the intelligence community had to be completely on board with this strategy. Otherwise, you would have started hearing static. There would have been counter leaks, and I think it's not widely enough known that the United States has 19 different intelligence services. We do have a director of national intelligence, but that director is not exactly a czar over the 19 different intelligence services. So there had to be, and I'm convinced that when journalists write the story, it will turn out there was months of consultation prior to the outbreak of the war to make sure that the intelligence services were agreed in principle on this strategy, and that also they agreed on the tactics whereby really timely intelligence information would be transmitted to the administration for tactical and strategic use. I think it's going to be a great story when it's written.
Oh yeah, the information war, that will be a great story. Absolutely. So next question is, why is President Biden? Why is President Biden and his followers? Why are President Biden and his followers afraid to confront and stand up to Putin in military terms?
Well, let me translate that question. Why is the United States afraid to get into a war with Russia? There's a two-word answer. There's a two-word answer to that question: nuclear weapons. If Russia did not have nuclear weapons, we'd be having a completely different conversation. But a number of studies of Russian military doctrines that I've read summaries of in recent days suggest that Vladimir Putin does not share that taboo against the use of tactical nuclear weapons that is quite pervasive in Western circles. And so he has, what the defense experts call escalation dominance. That is to say, he is willing to go further than we are. And President Biden has said very bluntly that he will not fight World War III in Ukraine. And that is the red line that he's drawn. We can argue about that red line, and it may transpire in the cold light of history that Mr. Putin was bluffing and never had any intention under any circumstances of crossing that line of taboo. But if you were president of the United States, would you bet the peace of the world on that proposition? So I think to summarize something or repeat something that I said towards the beginning of this conversation, I think that Mr. Biden's stance is that he will do everything in support of Ukraine that doesn't run a high risk of creating a direct military confrontation with Russia. And then we can argue about what the degree of risk is for each potential step. I happen to disagree with the Biden administration's assessment of the risk involved in transferring the Polish MiGs to the Ukrainian Air Force. I think we should do that. And I do not believe that Mr. Putin will regard that as the kind of escalation that's worthy of a nuclear response. I really don't. But on the other hand, the government is in possession of information that I'm not privy to. So maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's the way to think about the US response. Mm-hmm. And I know there's some argument to the effect that if the Biden administration had started arms transfers to Ukraine preemptively, that maybe that would have deterred the Russians. Who knows? Maybe it would have. But what I can tell you is that the political support needed to do that at the scale that we are now committed to through the recent appropriation of $13.6 billion in military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine did not exist prior to the outbreak of the war. There is no way that the Congress of the United States would have appropriated that sum in advance of the war itself. So I think we have to keep political limits firmly in mind as we're having this discussion.
What are you making out of the fact that the harshest reaction we heard from Putin so far was when Joe Biden called him a war criminal? I mean, he was really reacting forcefully, extremely forcefully, and saying this could bring relations to the brink of non-existence. Why is that?
I would say that relations right now are pretty close to the brink of non-existence, but maybe there's something going on that I'm not seeing. Here I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate. There are many long-term Putin watchers who've offered the opinion in recent weeks that something about Mr. Putin has changed. He seems to be less the cool, rational calculator that he was, for example, in the highly successful Russian military intervention in Syria. He doesn't seem to be doing cost-benefit analyses in his mind. He seems to be driven much more by emotions now, much more by historical grievances, much more by a sense of humiliation, personal and national, over what happened to Russia after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and that complex of attitudes is driving him a lot more. Under those circumstances, his ability to step back and just receive those words from Mr. Biden and shrug and go on, that capacity may be diminished by his changed emotional state. Serious observers of Putin are speculating about this. Some have noticed the dramatic puffiness of his face to be a sign that for one reason or another, he's using steroids. And if you know anything about the consequences of using steroids, they make you much more thin-skinned, much more volatile, much more aggressive. So that's a possibility too. I have no idea whether this is true, but once again, analysts I respect have offered this as a possibility.
Interesting question here. The war means more refugees. The far right is usually against refugees and foreigners coming in. Do they realize that Putin is the cause for this influx of refugees? And would this maybe change, this is what I add now, change the attitude people, and especially the conservatives, have towards refugees?
We'll see. These refugees are not black and brown, they're white. These refugees are not Muslims, they're Christians. We'll now find out whether the opposition was to refugees, tout court, as the French would say, or whether it was to a certain kind of refugee who represented a cultural threat. I noted, for example, as did many other American observers, that non-white refugees from Ukraine were treated very differently at the Polish borders from the way white ones were. And that suggested to me that it was cultural and ethnic factors driving opposition to refugees, not simply the fact that they came from a different country.
Mm-hmm.
And this took on, just to give you an amusing example, from recent American history, after Donald Trump made his famous comment about the character of African countries, I cannot repeat it on, on a family-oriented show, he then went on to ask, why don't we have more immigrants from Norway? Okay, now that tells me everything I need to know about what the real source of opposition to immigration is on the cultural right.
Very true. So next question is, do you think Mr. Putin will stop his war against the West if he wins against the Ukraine?
That is, of course, the question du jour, because if you ask the Poles and the Baltic nations, if you put that question to them, their answer is no. That if we don't stop him in Ukraine, that he will turn to them next.
Yeah, starting with Moldova, which is not a NATO country, and then the NATO countries in the Baltics.
And so, and so this is a question that has been asked in previous periods of history about the aspirations of dictators for expansion. If we give him this, will he be satisfied, or will it just whet his appetite? This was a major conversation in the years leading up to World War II, as everybody on this call knows. And as everybody on this call knows, most of the West got that question wrong, time after time and time, and we finally paid for it with a 6-year world war. Now, will history repeat itself? I don't know, but I think we have to take seriously the possibility that Ukraine will be a kind of Vorspeis, a kind of proof of concept for Mr. Putin, that ultimately, if he is tough enough and brazen enough, the West will not have the will to oppose him directly.
I mean, if his goal really is to reestablish the old Russia, or even the Soviet Union as resembling the old Russia, then he would have to go on, and he couldn't stop.
Well, look, I think we're talking about an aspiration, not a strategy, right? It's one thing, it's one thing to say, as he famously did, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I can think of a few others that might compete. But it is one thing to do that. It's another thing to take on members of NATO after the President of the United States has made it very, very clear that an attack on NATO will be interpreted through the prism of Article 5 of the NATO Charter and bring about an immediate confrontation between Russia and the United States, which it would. I think even Mr. Putin would think twice about going farther under these circumstances.
Janita Step-Greeny's question is a strategical one, and that would fit here. Why do you think Biden announced even ahead of the invasion that he would not send troops into Ukraine? Wouldn't it have been better to at least say all options are on the table and then see what happened?
There is an argument to be made in favor of that view. I believe, I can't prove, but I think when the history of this period is written, it will be found that Mr. Biden believed that if the option of direct American involvement had been left on the table, that he would have found it much more difficult to rally the country around the very energetic steps that the United States has been able to take with a fair degree of internal unity. So I think an argument can be made that taking that off the table was the price that he had to pay for what he's been able to achieve so far, which has been quite substantial. But it's a real debate, and I'll acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm. Caroline Gunderson asks, you mentioned your view that a new geopolitical era has been ushered in, one that will require Biden to acknowledge the United States' responsibility to undertake burdens it previously regarded as avoidable. Beyond recommitment to military spending and engagement, to which specific burdens are you referring? Or is it a general re-engagement in areas that, from a military standpoint, have been left by the wayside over the last decades? So what were you referring to?
Well, I was referring in the first instance, of course, to increased military capacity. But I was also talking about the focus of our diplomacy. And from the very beginning, the Biden administration was clearly committed to fortifying and expanding U.S. alliances. And I think that as we did during the Cold War, we would have to put together a number of different dimensions of the fight. And I've talked about military, diplomatic. What about information? You know, up until the late 1990s, we had something called the U.S. Information Agency, which we abolished on the grounds that there was no need for it anymore. Well, I never thought that abolishing the USIA was a good idea. And if we could just wave a wand and get it back, I'm sure Mr. Biden would do that in a heartbeat. So we may have to consider new ways of organizing the information contest and new institutions to help us to do so. We'll also have to think more strategically about the use of economic assistance and economic relations. So in the same way that the Cold War was a struggle waged on multiple fronts, and we were at our best when we coordinated those fronts towards the shared objective. If I'm right about this, then I think we're going to have to do the same thing again under very changed circumstances. And I will say, with a lot more transparency, whether or not we want it, the kinds of opacity that the United States government was able to preserve during the Cold War, I think are unavailable now. So everything would have to be done with the understanding that it was likely to become public very quickly.
Another question here is, Putin claims that he's trying to denazify Ukraine. Shouldn't that be a reason for the far right to not sympathize with him and his politics?
Well, there's a distinction. There's a distinction between cultural conservatives and Nazis, first of all. But secondly, of all of the claims that Mr. Putin has made, that is among the least credible.
Yeah.
Right? For a country led by a Jewish comedian who got 70% of the vote. I mean, does anyone seriously believe that Mr. Zelensky is heading a fascist government, as Mr. Putin is charging? I mean, it's just ridiculous on its face. Nobody takes it seriously. I'm not even sure that Mr. Putin takes it seriously, except there is, of course, this deep well of Russian history from which he's drawing, where, to be frank, there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers in Ukraine. And there was a lot of collaboration between Nazi sympathizing Ukrainians and the German army. And Ukrainians were complicit in barbarous acts towards various groups. So there is that history, and to be fair, there are some paramilitary groups, not the government, not the official military, but some paramilitary groups in Ukraine that do have some fascist sympathies. But the argument that that is the dominant force in Ukraine and that the country needs to be denazified, I mean, that might have been true in 1946.
Yeah, but it's 2 generations later now.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So next one is, during the midterms, how will Republicans manage to court voters on the right end of the spectrum without coming across as pro-Putin? Or will the far right just abandon the Republican Party and either not vote or turn to more obscure politicians without party affiliation?
I don't think so. I think that most people on the far right will rally to the support of the Republican Party. And as a tactical matter, the answer is very simple. You focus on domestic culture war issues. And Republican leaders have already made it very clear that's what they intend to do. So they're going to talk about crime. They're going to talk about immigration. They are going to talk about what they regard as abuses in public schools. They're going to talk about left-wing ideologies and their influence in law schools and other places. You can do all of that without saying a word about Vladimir Putin. And I would be surprised if Ukraine turned out to be a core building block of the Republican political agenda for the fall campaign. I think that would, whenever you're trying to put together a campaign for a diverse political party, it's good to focus on what you have in common and also on what distinguishes you from the other party. And it's not clear to me that Ukraine meets either of those two criteria for Republicans right now.
Mm-hmm. So the last question I'm having is going towards this culture war and into this direction. With which rhetoric does Putin resonate most with the US right? Is it homophobia, misogyny, or xenophobia?
I think it's fair to say that, as I have several times, it was the idea that Putin is a nationalist, Putin is a Christian, Putin is a social conservative who is opposed to same-sex marriage, gays and lesbians, gender fluidity. A lot of this has to do with the right wing's horror at the blurring of bright gender lines. And Mr. Putin is seen as a defender of traditional gender roles, identities, and relations. And I think that's the principal source of his appeal. I don't think that what's happening in Ukraine is strengthening his appeal to the right in this country. I think it's weakening it, or at least confusing it.
Mm-hmm. All right, so thank you very much. Our 16 questions that that you answered, quite a lot, and thank you so much for this insight. And I would like to give back the microphone to Christiane Püker.
Yeah, thank you so very much, both of you. And indeed, that was a lot of very interesting and insightful thinking, and also you have given us a lot of food for thought. And thank you also to the audience for the further questions. And we have to, and we will certainly continue to pursue these very complex topics. So thank you again. And if you are interested in further events of the DAZ and the cooperation with the other German-American centers in Germany, please visit our website, www.daz.org. And just a little commercial break now, a note about the next two events this week. If you're interested, on Thursday, as part of the series, The Future of the Transatlantic Space, or what we say in German, die Zukunft des transatlantischen Traumes, the colleagues of the Atlantic Academy in Kaiserslautern will offer a talk on how to make our platforms less polarizing by Professor Chris Bale. And on Saturday, completely different topic, the DAZ in Stuttgart, in cooperation with the Akademie für gesprochenes Wort, will offer a night of poetry reading and live music as part of the Französische Wochen here in Stuttgart. And this will be about the poetry of American poets Emily Dickinson and Joyce Shintani. And we will have the pleasure to have a musical framing with specially composed music. So again, thank you very much, Arthur Landwehr, Dr. Gaston, for joining us, also to the audience. And I really sincerely hope that we will have more peaceful times soon. All of you, have a good evening. Thank you.